folks. Hopefully, there we go. There we go. I was waiting for the participants to hit 50. So I think we can get started now. That was just an arbitrary number that I was watching.
All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Michelle Mulroney. I am the WRED committee co-chair for the Washington State Recycling Association. And this morning we are putting on a presentation in regards to the EPR bill. So there is a lot of information that's out there and some of it can be confusing and hard to find. So we have Preston Peck, who wears quite a few hats, and I'll let him kind of share his position. And he is going to try to give us all that information and resources and get us pointed all in the right direction. This is something that is new to Washington, and we have a lot of people that are interested. We had over 80 people that registered and over 50 people on the call. So we do expect to have a conversation at the end of his presentation. So if you have any questions, feel free to either put them in the chat, write them down. At the end of his presentation, you can pop on and ask, or you can put it in the chat and we can ask for you. Either way is fine. We are recording this, so if anybody does not want to have their picture on there, go ahead and keep your camera off. And Preston, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. Welcome, everybody. Happy to be here. As Michelle was saying, my name is Preston Peck. I am here on behalf of the Northwest Product Stewardship Council today, but also am a WSRA board member and also work for the City of Tacoma Solid Waste Management, which is, for those who don't know, is one of a handful of municipal haulers in the state of Washington. So we bring a somewhat unique perspective to the conversation in that regards, but the hat I'll be wearing today will be Northwest Product Stewardship Council member. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Then we can go ahead and get started with the presentation. How's it coming through, Michelle? Still seeing the right slide?
Looking great.
Okay, good deal. I'm going to get this out of the way. Beautiful. So yeah, thanks everybody for joining us today. As I mentioned, I'm a member of the Northwest Product Stewardship Council. That's a coalition of government organizations in Washington and Oregon. The council's mission is to enhance Washington and Oregon's reuse, recycling, and waste management systems by working with the waste and recycling industry, local governments, consumers, manufacturers, environmental, non-governmental organizations, and others to connect producers with the costs associated with the end-life management of their products. The council has been studying a wide range of policies and programs that would improve reuse, recycling, and waste management for over 20 years, such as product stewardship, and for the context of this conversation, extended producer responsibility, or EPR for short, as I'll be calling it. So today's presentation is talking about how EPR could be potentially a tool for modernizing recycling in Washington. So I run a lot of meetings. It's good to always have an agenda so people kind of know what's coming. We'll start off talking about the current state of recycling in Washington, some challenges with our current system. Then I'll do a little bit of an introduction to the EPR framework. Then I'll talk specifically about an upcoming bill known as the RENEW Act that would really look at implementing an EPR program for paper and packaging products in Washington. And at the end, we'll leave lots of room for questions, conversations. I'm sure it's a very complex topic, so don't feel like there's any questions that we perhaps haven't heard before, or don't be afraid to ask, because this is really supposed to be an informational presentation and meeting. So we want to try to get the most out of it as possible. So please don't hesitate to ask your questions, but I would ask that you hold them till the end or put them in the chat. Then we can come back to them later, just so that we can continue flowing through the presentation. So thank you very much. So starting off is a little bit of a PSA or something you may see on local TV. Do you or your organization suffer from any of the following currently? Perhaps confused residents who complain about what's accepted in Seattle versus other jurisdictions. No knock on Seattle, it's just a question that a lot of communities have. Yeah, ever have a resident come and talk to you about why do I need scissors to open a package of scissors? I think about, for anybody who's a Curb Your Enthusiasm fan, there's a scene with Larry David and he's trying ferociously to open some scissors, but he needs the scissors to open the package, which is a bit ironic. I'm sure, like many of you, folks have been working for decades on recycling programs, yet as you'll see through some data I'll show you later, we still have over 16% of the load going to the landfill being paper and 13% in plastic still going to the landfill. And then finally, I do a lot of outreach and education, and especially in Tacoma, we made the decision for a variety of factors to transition from curbside glass to drop-off methodology. So I get a lot of questions about from residents, why is my bill going up, but my services are decreasing? You're asking me to do more. So hopefully you have encountered some of these questions, and we may provide a little bit of insights into some answers or some possible solutions later on. But we'll start at looking at the current system of recycling and waste management in Washington. And this is a snapshot into all of the different factors that go into our current system. There's a lot of different systems at play and different variables that are impacting those. And so we at City of Tacoma have really concentrated on what we can control, but a lot of it is outside of our control. If you see on your screen, kind of the circles with the bold black around them are areas that we've identified as potential points of leverage that we actually can control. But you can see the vast majority of the circles are not circled because we have no control over them. So this is part of to contextualize the conversation around EPR and thinking about how can we make the system work together for all the entities and still provide a little bit more clarity on how materials are flowing and whose responsibility that is to actually see it through at the end of life management. So currently there's an expectation with our system. The current expectation that supports our recycling system is that residents are going to purchase a product, and then usually that comes in some sort of packaging, and then that resident will place the recyclable packaging, if it's accepted curbside, into their cart for collection from a hauler. So currently the resident is paying for both the product itself and the packaging that's included, and the services to actually take that material and get it recycled. EPR addresses this, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So how is this working? How's this current system with all of the different variables at play, currently kind of the resident being in the middle of the situation? How is it working? Well, starting off, you're looking at some data from Department of Ecology from their waste generation and recovery data from 2017, and it looks at the recovery rate in Washington for materials collected. And you can see that from 2000 to say 2010, 2011, things were trending upward, and we got from around 37% to about 56.5%. Many people on this call have probably spent countless hours educating customers on how to properly recycle accepted materials. And I would say that these numbers, although from 2011 to 2017, you can see have somewhat stagnated, this is not in vain because Washington does have a truly high recycling rate comparative to the rest of the nation, which is great, but could we do more is the question. And we've achieved this really by working with private waste management companies, haulers and MRFs, but the residents are still paying the cost. So we want to try to look at how EPR may help this stagnation and really get us to where we could be. Also, there's some lost opportunities. So every 5 years, Ecology does a waste characterization study. And this one that you're seeing the data from in front of you was conducted in 2020. Given we're in the midst of a pandemic, there's going to be some abnormalities. That's completely understandable, but the data is still relevant. When Department of Ecology put this out, it showed that over 16% of the paper and over 13% of the plastic are still going to the landfill. If we translate that into tonnages, you're looking at about 1.5 million tons of paper and plastic still going to the landfill, which is a lot. And what could we do to try to recover this? And what systems could we put in place to really maximize getting that, capturing it, and recycling that stuff? So in addition to kind of the materials being collected, still going to the landfill, rates are still increasing for residents across the state. We saw that in Tacoma. We implemented a $2.82 surcharge to help with the increased processing, marketing, and shipping fees associated kind of in the aftermath of China national sword policy. Hopefully you're familiar with that policy, but if you're not, we can have that conversation later. So right now, residents are being asked to absorb the rising cost of recycling. What you're seeing in front of you is the rate increase on average in UTC regulated areas. And so those areas have seen an increase of about 36% since 2015. Ratepayers or residents, they don't have much influence in how much they're paying for recycling. It's really independent on how much they recycle and how good or bad they are at it. And even if one particular jurisdiction is, say, very good and has a very low contamination rate, currently these jurisdictions are kind of working in isolation with different processors, all feeding into the same system, which has impacts system-wide, regardless of if one's really good. If one's really bad, then it could have impacts statewide. So thinking about kind of harmonization and kind of how we can bring this system together. And local governments are reacting to this. As I mentioned, some are reducing materials collected curbside. We did this in Tacoma with plastic bags. King County has done it as well. Implementing surcharges or rate increases. We saw this across UTC jurisdictions, as well as in independent cities. Reducing collection frequency, so moving to, say, every other week. Tacoma did that a while back. Spokane has most recently done that. And then some places are discontinuing curbside recycling programs altogether just because they are so expensive to maintain. And that creates an access issue for residents. And as you can see from this chart here, right now, only about 58% of Washington municipalities have residential curbside recycling. There's no curbside at all in 11 of Washington's 39 counties. Now, this is not a fault to those communities. We don't mean to call them out and say, you're doing a bad job. These programs are very costly and require conditions that may just simply be out of reach for jurisdictions in many parts of the state. For many communities, there aren't systems for getting back a lot of that packaging material and leaving communities kind of on their own to figure out, what do I do with this? Or really leaving residents on their own to figure out, what do I do with this? I want to do the right thing with it, but I just don't have access to it. So the increasingly challenging economics of recycling under the current kind of ratepayer funded model makes it harder than ever to address the need for greater service equity among Washington's residents. And we're hearing a good bit about what residents are saying. This is some information from a recently launched Recycling Ambassadors program that we launched in Tacoma about a year and a half ago. And it's been really interesting to see kind of the evolution of a conversation when we start to educate residents on kind of how the recycling system works, both in Tacoma and then as a state and kind of an international level as well. Many of those conversations are driven to kind of these questions. These are some particular statements that we received, but they all kind of move around this to some degree, such as, why do they, being producers, manufacturers of these packaging products, why do they keep selling things that we can't recycle? If that material is so hard to recycle, why do they keep producing it? And why do we have to do all the work as residents? And the people who produce this packaging don't really have to do anything insofar as the end of life management of them. And much of that is true. And really, as an educator and outreach person, I know that all the education that we do and all the dollars that we put towards it aren't going to make some products that residents interact with on a day-to-day basis any more recyclable. I can tell them to put it in the trash, or I can tell them to put it in the recycling if there's markets, and I've been instructed by our MRF that they want to accept this product. But a lot of it is out of their control and out of the jurisdiction's control as well. So now that I've identified some kind of problems with our system or challenges that we faced, what are some potential solutions? One potential solution to something is always to do nothing, to maintain the status quo, kind of to keep doing what we're doing, while introducing some incremental change. We can continue kind of adding or taking away aspects of the system, but there's only so much room to grow and change in the current system. If you've ever played a game of Jenga, whether it be it the giant Jenga or the small Jenga, whatever have you, there's only a finite amount of blocks that you can build on until you kind of reach a stopping point where there's nothing more that you can do. So that's kind of an analogy with incremental changes. There's going to be a point of diminishing returns where there's only so much that we can do. So then we start to look at things like plastic bags or shredded paper, like in Tacoma, and try to eliminate these problematic items from curbside. Film, plastic film's another one. But it's kind of like a game of whack-a-mole. Like products keep popping up in the open market. We have to react to them as jurisdictions and then educate residents on how to deal with these, how to properly dispose of them. So it can be a little bit frustrating, a little bit challenging, and it keeps jurisdictions in a reactionary kind of position. And then finally, we can just kind of hope and pray that things kind of change, and from the jurisdiction's perspective, and just kind of wish it upon it. Another option would be potential modernization. And so I'm using this as an analogy. This is a picture of my truck. It's a 1969 Chevy C10. I love this truck. It was my grandfather's truck. It is very close to me. I've had it for many years. It gets me safely from point A to point B when I need to. It can carry lots of stuff, which has been very nice, such as like a half quart of wood. It's been very cold recently, so it's great that I have firewood and I was able to go get it with my truck. And usually it starts on the first try. Sometimes I have to play with it a little bit, but usually it's pretty reliable. But I would love it if I got more than, say, 10 miles to the gallon. It would be great to have some air conditioning on, those few really hot summer days that we get in Washington. I'm originally from Alabama, so I can deal with it, but it would still be nice. And I love music. I would love if it had, say, a Bluetooth connection in it where I could listen to music while I was driving, but I deal with the AM radio. So Chevrolet also kind of recognized that this model works, this is great, and but they continuously are improving upon their models. They recognize that their customers, the people who are looking at purchasing their products and involved in their system, wanted something more. So the picture that I'm showing you now is of a new Chevrolet Silverado that was built on a lot of the kind of the frame and the history of their C10 models. And it gets way better gas mileage. It has AC, it's got a Bluetooth speaker, but it's built on decades of experience. They took what they knew and what worked well and then built on it to create something more modern that is what their customers are looking for. So how could I use that to frame the conversation? What could we do in Washington that could build on our current infrastructure, on our current knowledge of what works and what doesn't, to create a system that's modernized, that modernizes the system to be something that the residents need now? Well, one potential option of that would be something called extended producer responsibility, or like I said, EPR. So this is the EPR 101 course, so we're going to start very basic with this. So at its core, EPR is a law that mandates responsibilities to producers for the end-of-life management of their products. And they can create an individual producer accountability through either a collective entity, such as a producer responsibility organization, also known as a PRO. You'll hear me reference that later. Or they can kind of act independently. Usually it's more efficient and effective for them to create a PRO and work together because it streamlines a lot of the reporting processes. At its core, it is a polluters pays model. So the more products that you're putting out into the market that are not able to be responsibly managed at the end of their life, you are going to have to pay for that to fund the systems to collect it. So EPR is an outcomes-based policy. It requires producers to fully fund recycling for all residents, invest in infrastructure improvements, create and fund consistent education and outreach, as I know many of the educators on this call would love to see some consistent messaging for residents across the state, because folks don't live their lives by these geopolitical boundaries that we've set up, and Tacoma's here and Pierce County's here and so forth and so on. They travel and they need to know what to do. It also helps because it meets mandated recycling and reuse targets and ensures responsible recycling, which we saw a lot of the impacts of that after China National Sword, when a lot of materials started going to areas around the world that were just not equipped to handle the volume of that material. And it ended up being a big environmental justice issue. And then it allows us to use recycled materials in new products. So it kind of creates this flow, which I'll describe a little bit more later too. So EPR is not new. Actually, one of the first EPR programs started in Germany in the 1990s. In the US, producer responsibility has generally been used for products outside of the residential recycling system. But in Europe and Canada, they've applied it to packaging and paper products, your typical recyclables, and used to support residential recycling programs for decades. So there's a lot of information to learn from and to build upon. Today, producer responsibility programs for packaging are being adopted at an accelerating rate, and many countries are preparing for implementation in the next 2 to 3 years. This means that many of the multinational corporations that sell products into Washington are already familiar with EPR programs and participating in these programs elsewhere around the world. And we've seen some pretty good results from that. Anecdotally, British Columbia implemented EPR, and they saw a 9% increase in access to recycling service and a 20% increase in recovery rate for packaging and paper products. But that system's not perfect. And what can we do to take a concept like EPR that has worked well globally and make it fit for Washington and our needs? Now, you can probably see on this map that the US as a whole is great. That's due to no federal EPR legislation. But last year, Maine and Oregon both passed EPR bills and are looking forward towards implementation. So there are states in the US that are now implementing EPR policies for paper and packaging products. And on that, the concept so far as EPR, not for paper and packaging, but EPR programs, it's not new to Washington. We've had EPR programs here that address specific items. So, and Washington has been on the forefront of a lot of those programs that place more responsibility and funding requirements for collection on the producers of specific materials. So you see 4 programs that exist in Washington, from eCycle Washington, Light Recycle Washington, Take Back Your Meds, and Paint Care. So very specific products, but EPR models nonetheless. So how would EPR work? What would it actually look like? So the chart that you're seeing right now, currently residents are paying for the product and collection service, and that's the responsibility of the local government. Be it through collecting it through themselves, like Tacoma does, or through contracts with private haulers. The end market of these products are considered primarily proprietary information. And as we saw with the impacts with China Sword, forcing materials to countries not equipped to deal with them can create some pretty big environmental justice issues when you don't have sound end markets. Transition. In an EPR program, the collection and processing becomes the responsibility of those producers who manufacture the paper and packaging, but also includes government oversight for accountability to the residents. Additionally, through setting thoughtful and intentional recycling rates and dates, EPR can create a consistent supply of materials for verifiable end markets, encouraging a truly circular economy. So typically when you're looking at the waste industry, there's kind of 4 key areas of possible action. They are product design, public education, infrastructure investments, and end markets. Traditionally, we focus our efforts on the kind of the middle 2, we being kind of the haulers, processors, like Tacoma, jurisdictions. We typically focus on public education and infrastructure investments, but that's only going to take us so far. The end markets issue so far was actually partially addressed last year through Senate Bill 5022, which helped to kind of build the demand, but we need to develop a clean supply through EPR, and we have mostly left product design up to producers. When we address end markets and product design while continuing to support strong public education and infrastructure investments, we can create a well-coordinated system that allows for clean, safe materials flowing through a truly circular economy. So there's some main goals and solutions. I want to talk about EPR and kind of move into the conversation about what this actually looks like in bill format, so far as the Renew Act. So some kind of goals here that we're really looking at are manufacturers and brands are to finance a coordinated system that includes education, collection, recycling, processing, and more. A specific list of covered materials is defined to help with that harmonization and kind of decrease confusion. And it's the roles of all the players, the roles of all the players are well defined within the system. There's state agency involvement for oversight and enforcement, local governments as accountability to the residents, private haulers that help with collection, processors that actually move the materials through their system, and others, producers, another one. There's specific performance standards that are established to encourage the system to keep getting better. And a potential solution that we're looking at is the proposed Renew Act. So what is the Renew Act? It's also an outcomes-based policy that would really look at bringing in and covering from an EPR model all paper and packaging products that come into Washington. It would hopefully increase reuse and recycling through this process. It would provide convenient access to recycling across the state, including multifamily housing and public places. Also would include a harmonized list of accepted materials, again, decreasing confusion, and ensure that things are actually getting recycled in ways that meet our environmental, labor, health, and safety standards. So we can avoid environmental injustices like we saw in kind of the aftermath of China Sword. And that's one question I'm getting more and more from residents, kind of where are these materials going and what's the end result of that. So what would adoption of a statewide producer responsibility policy for packaging mean for Washington? It would require that packaging producers fund this coordinated system, residential recycling system across the state with participation from local governments and other stakeholders. It would create mandated targets, clear and consistent labeling for recyclability. That's another question I get all the time is, well, it's got the triangle on it, so can I recycle it? As many of the educators know, no is the answer, but hopefully give them more information. And it would also require post-consumer content for additional products such as tubs, PET thermoforms, and single-use cups. And there have been several benefits to this. There are economic benefits, social, and environmental. Economic, it would create some stable funding for recycling and investments for improvement. That's one challenge we've really faced at the city of Tacoma, has been that kind of stable funding source given the volatility in the markets. It would also allow for residents would not have to pay for these recycling services anymore. And I'm sure many governments would tell you that they're not paying for it right now, but they are paying for it through embedded rates. So that would eliminate that. The social benefits would be convenience factors, increased access and free access to all residents in Washington. There's estimated over 1,600 new local green living wage jobs that would be created through this adoption of this policy. And environmental benefits would be that we would be recycling more, over 50% more materials than today, which quantity-wise around 280,000 tons. And really where a lot of the conversation is going now is how is this reducing greenhouse gases? Well, it's estimated that the system would save almost 2 million metric tons of CO2 emissions every year. There's also energy saved in the materials themselves. I think many of you on this call are probably in the recycling industry, understand virgin material versus recycled material, but for those who may not, virgin material is actually the new material being extracted, the new product that creates aluminum actually being extracted. So far as energy saved, aluminum being recycled would save a lot of energy, plastic, copper, paper, steel, and then glass. All of this would create more energy savings that would help to reduce our overall emissions and energy use. So many of you might be curious about kind of what are these mandated recycling and reuse targets? Well, in the proposed act, the mandate would be that 75% of all covered products would be recycled or reused by 2030. And you can see that specifically broken down by material, covered material, and then you see the reuse target at the bottom. So 10%, that 10% is of the 75% of all covered products, to make sure that those products we're developing reuse markets, because that's really where I think we need to go so far as the biggest impact. But in the meantime, we need to continue the recycling system, but develop it in a more modernized way that's going to meet the needs of residents and municipalities and all players today. The overall goal, kind of the big picture goal of this proposed policy, would be that all packaging and printed products must be reusable, recyclable, or compostable no later than January 1st, 2030. So how would it work? What does this new system look like? And this slide is showing you a very high level. It's a very big policy. And so there's lots of moving parts, but I wanted to try to kind of walk you through this a little bit so that you can understand kind of how this might play out and what your role might be in it. So we'll start with kind of state oversight, because that's something that I've been talking a lot about that. So right now in the proposed bill, that would fall under Department of Ecology, who would oversee rulemaking, registration of products, reviews and approve plans that I'll talk a little bit more about, and performance, and then also look at compliance and enforcement as well. Then on the other side, on your left-hand side of the screen in the blue circle, you see producers. The idea would be that they would probably want to form a producer responsibility organization and work together, as it would be more efficient for them to do so. And then kind of in between, you have your state oversight and then your producers. You have a Renew Advisory Council, and this is made up of kind of lots of different players within the industry, but also lots of people who have a stake at play so far as well. That's kind of being worked out right now, but it's a very broad, diverse group of different stakeholders that would both advise the producers and Department of Ecology on kind of how things are going with this work. There would be a needs assessment too that the producers would conduct to look at kind of what infrastructure investments are needed within the system, how much do things cost so far as collection, administration, those kind of things, and that would inform a pro plan. So that would be the producer's plan that says, okay, great, here's what we think based on the needs assessment we need so far as a reimbursement formula for local governments, or drop-off stations for X materials. All that would go into the plan, and all of that would go to Department of Ecology for review to make sure that they feel like it fits the law and is going to get them to the mandated rates. And that pro plan, during implementation, that plan is going to be looked at, and the producers are going to be providing annual reports to Department of Ecology. How are we doing? What changes do we need to make? So forth and so on. So that kind of gives you the producer, state oversight, and then the advisory council with the plans involved. And so where do local governments fit in? Well, producers would fund this for local governments, be it through your contracting services, or if you're direct hauling, like City of Tacoma is, if you're a municipal hauler, then the producers would fund that through a reimbursement formula. But we would continue to provide those services or maintain our existing contracts, and could conduct education and outreach, because we know that sometimes it's more beneficial for local people to be doing education and outreach for a variety of reasons, be it trust, messaging, they know their community, they know how to talk to people, they know who the key people are, and how to get their information out there. So that would be funded through the producers. And the producers would be paying service providers to continue their role as haulers and processors. And all of that is serving the residents, but they are not paying for any of it. So to dive a little bit deeper, I'm sure, I mean, I myself had questions about the funding aspect. So how would funding work? Well, producers are responsible for funding the recycling services provided to households and public spaces statewide. So this would be universal, consistent recycling collection, including expansion where needed to increase access to get them to those rates. Would cover transport, processing, marketing of materials, to also to include greater transparency on end markets that I talked a lot about earlier, and would coordinate statewide education and outreach to address contamination and resident confusion, because the system is not going to work if residents continue to be confused about what can go in their curbside bin and what cannot. And so producers would compensate cities and counties that provide collection or outreach services for all reasonable costs associated with those services, including management and administrative costs to deal with that. So I get a lot of questions too from local jurisdictions about kind of how does the authority work in this? Well, municipal haulers and cities and counties with contracts with service providers would still continue providing services to residents and are reimbursed by the producers. Existing UTC regulations, collection services, franchises remain in place, but rates are paid by the producers, and services are aligned for statewide consistency and expansion to provide universal access. Essentially, producers pay for the service, fill the gaps to increase access, improve recycling, and ensure markets for collected materials. So this is a lot. I'm giving you a lot of information right now. And this law would, if passed, would fundamentally change recycling in Washington for the better. But big change like this wouldn't happen overnight. There will be 5 years between potentially when the law would be adopted and the plan rollout, which would include time for producers to join the PRO and register with Ecology, conduct a needs assessment performed by right now, potentially exploring the idea of a third-party consultant to determine system gaps. The PRO would need to develop a plan to meet all of their targets. There would need to be formation of the Renew Advisory Council that I mentioned before. They would review the plan, provide ongoing counsel on the program. And as I mentioned, the group would be made up of a pretty diverse group of stakeholders from local governments, haulers, producers, environmental groups, small businesses, and members representing traditionally underserved communities as well. And as local jurisdiction solid waste management plans expire, I just went through this process with Pierce County, and it was shout out to Pierce County for a great process. Those solid waste management plans would get updated to align with new plans in coordination with Ecology, so that all of this system would be working together to try to maximize the efficiency of it and the best outcome for everybody involved, including residents who are at the forefront of this. So now that I've talked you through kind of the challenges that the system is facing, potential solutions, kind of timeline for implementation, how you can get involved, what are some immediate and long-term actions that you could take as being a member of this industry or knowing people who are members of this industry? I think the most immediate thing is like this is a very basic introduction into EPR. I'm still learning too. I think it's kind of ongoing learning for everybody involved, but you need to continue to educate yourself and others on what EPR is and what EPR is not. And then long-term aspect, I'd say follow the legislative process, keeping yourself and others informed on EPR policies, how they impact your organization. Look for opportunities to address ongoing recycling, reuse, and prevention through EPR policies, and consider integrating EPR principles into county solid waste management plans or other organizational plans as it makes sense. And so now I think we'll open it up for questions. Going back to the truck conversation, this is a picture of my dad and I about to go hunting in front of our truck. So as I mentioned, it's been with me for a long time. So yeah, I'll stop sharing and we can just dive into questions.
Wow, Preston, great job. That was a really thorough presentation. Yeah, you covered a lot. There is a lot as far as EPR goes, but you did a great job getting it through. I know we did have one question in the chat. It's asking, is the paper recycling goal an average of OCC plus other paper? Because I was told by a paper industry person that 20 to 30% of paper out there isn't collected because it's in books and other things that don't get recycled.
I believe that they're separate, but let me call on Heather to make sure that I got that right. Heather Trim, would you mind jumping on and helping me out here? Heather, you're on.
Yes, hi everybody. Heather Trim, Zero Waste Washington, and I believe Adrian is also here. So right now, the way the target is set up, as the bill is currently written, paper is one category in the recycling target. So that is something that could be discussed further, but right now it is one target, and so that's a that's the sub targets underneath the larger target of 75% recycling for all of the covered products. And then there's the subcategories that Preston showed on that slide where you had a breakout by the submaterials. Adrian, looks like you have a comment too.
Yeah, I'd just like to make a comment that might not be clear. The recycling rates that are listed in the bill are actually measured upon how much the producers supply to Washington compared to how much is actually recycled. So it's not exactly, when we talk about recycling rates here in King County, for example, we often talk it in relation to how much goes to landfills and how much gets collected to go into a MRF. But the recycling rates in the bill are actually measured on what's reported that gets sold or distributed as junk mail into Washington compared to what's actually collected. So books are not included in this, so it wouldn't be part of recycling rate.
Thank you, Adrian. Yeah, as you can see, you can get there's a balance between staying at the 101 level and then the Adrian and Heather level of 201, 301, 401. So I appreciate y'all being on the call and helping out. So much appreciated. I see there's another question in the chat. How is it that producers will be funding all of these new program items and none of this cost will be passed on to the consumers in some way? It's a good question. The question comes up a lot. My response to that would be that, as I mentioned previously in one of my slides, that these are not new programs. EPR programs are not new programs. They're happening all over the world. The main players, the main producers are multinational corporations. They've been working on this for a long time. And I haven't seen any data from the research showing that a basket of goods would go up significantly from this policy. And the fact of the matter is that we've seen how this played out across the world, and that just hasn't been the case. So that's what we do know. And I would say that, yeah, that look at other programs and see how they've reacted there, and you can get an idea of how that would react here in Washington.
But I guess on the other side of that too, Preston, I mean, if we look at like the paint care bill, which just came out, they did put that cost back to the paint. So any consumer purchasing paint is technically covering the cost. However, I think it's spread a little bit better versus you're just buying stuff, but you're not recycling it. You're not putting the money into that program either. So I think some of the cost probably will go to the consumer, but yeah, I don't know if that information is out there. Obviously, you haven't heard of any specifics on what those costs could look like.
Right. Yeah. And I think you're spreading it over more materials too. Like when you're just dealing with paint, then you're working with just one material. When you start talking about all paper and packaging products across, many different countries, many different, or, with us, it'd be across the whole state. I have seen that typically producers would react by spreading that cost over so that they can remain competitive still, right? I'll just say Pepsi and Coke. Pepsi doesn't want to jack up the price of Pepsi by 50 cents when Coca-Cola is down here, because that would not make them competitive anymore. I see another question. Adrian, Heather, anything to add on that before I move on? We have time.
No, I mean, you did a great job. And there was a study that looked at a basket of goods in Oregon did a study looking at a basket of goods in locations where they had EPR and locations where they did not. And there was no difference in price of the goods related to the EPR. There were things like, transportation and market fluctuations and things like that, which actually have the impact.
Thank you. So Mary King asked, would this legislation only apply to Washington state producers? Who is responsible for all of the stuff that comes from out of state or other countries? Good question, Mary. So my understanding with the Renew Act is that it covers any producers that put these covered products into the state, that they would be involved with that.
And if I could add, so what happened last year with SB 5022, the bill that banned styrofoam, had the opt-in for utensils and condiment packs and et cetera, and the recycled content for 3 different products. In that bill, there was a very long and very detailed negotiation over the definition of producer. In other words, who is responsible for the material, and really comes down to who makes the choices of the packaging for that item that you find on the shelf wherever, or you get in your mailbox. And so that definition is a very highly negotiated, lawyers looking at every word and comma, but it also helps clarify who's responsible in terms of paying. And it is any item that would then be, like as Preston said, that is then sold or delivered into Washington state or distributed into Washington state. So for example, if you are a Costco, you are not responsible unless it's the Kirkland brand, then you would be. and then, et cetera. I'm not happy to answer any more questions on that.
Thank you, and sorry for cutting out. Am I coming through all right? Can you give me a head nod? Okay, I just switched over to my headset mic for clarity. Thank you for those who let me know. I think I'm going back up. Jaron asked, do you see this bill expanding access to recycling to those counties you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation in Washington that currently do not have recycling? I do, yes, just to be straightforward, yeah. A couple of different reasons why, because there's language in the current proposed, there's proposed language right now talking specifically about access and what those requirements are. And then the materials, the mandated materials and numbers, they play into that as well, because there's only so much material right in the Puget Sound area. So if producers want to hit these targets, they're going to have to increase access or figure out how to get those materials in some way that's convenient for the residents, because they're going to have to hit these targets by 2030. Moving on, Pete asked, how would this legislation encourage producers to make better packaging? Use less plastic, for example. Yeah, so there's a concept that I didn't get into because it's pretty complicated, but happy to talk to anybody about it, and would probably kick it over to Adrian or Heather for more about this, but a process or a concept called Ecomodulation that basically sets different penalties or benefits that producers will receive based on the type of packaging that they're designing and how recyclable or reusable it is in our current system. That's it at a very base level. So yeah, it's a financial incentive for them to make, not necessarily with less plastic, but more recyclable. So that's really the concept right now, because we have a lot of lightweight plastic going to the landfill right now.
Yeah, and to add to both of those, so the whole point of this bill is to bring recycling access across the entire state and to have it be uniform across the entire state. So what you're putting in your bin in Seattle will be the same as what you're putting in your bin in some more rural location. I was going to say Walla Walla, because Walla Walla right now doesn't even have recycling. In terms of the eco-modulation fees, so a great example is France. They have, what they do is the producers charge each other. So this is all internal to themselves. If you're part of a producer responsibility organization, then they set the fees. Walla Walla does have recycling. It's just a very limited acceptance list. Thank you, Heather. So I couldn't remember where they took away recycling altogether. Anyway, curbside, that is. In France, for example, if you have a glass bottle of beer, which is something they do as a specialty item there, but it has a ceramic stopper, that would give you a big negative on you would have to pay more for that, because you have mixed materials. And as you all know, in glass recycling, if you have one little teeny bit of ceramic in there, it will ruin their entire batch of molten glass. Then they also have benefits. They have pro if you, for example, do have it lighter weighted, and especially if it's easy to recycle. And so it's not multi-material and it's easy to recycle. So an eco-modulation fee is a really good way to motivate the producers to design their packaging well, but we're not specifying in the bill what those must be, because what would be a good eco-modulation sort of incentive today might be very different than what it would be in 10 or 15 years. And it looks like Adrian has something to add here, although we maybe should get to the next question too.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Heather and Preston said. I mean, the whole idea of EPR and eco-modulation, and it connects to the costs that go on to the consumers, is it provides economic incentives for producers to actually change their packaging to be more recyclable, reusable, or compostable, or even reduce their packaging, because it is paid by weight or by unit. That way, it becomes a cost of doing business here in Washington, and it becomes a cost of the design that they choose. So that's the whole idea behind it. If they make something that's refillable, then they pay less. If they make something that's hard to recycle, they pay more.
That's a very good summary there, Adrian. Appreciate that. Moving on, I'll move on to the next question, and because we've talked for a long time about eco-modulation, the nuances and intricacies of that. So I'm very happy that I work with Heather and Adrian and many other people that are very smart on the subject and can help me. Karen asks, how do you think increased access to recycling would impact the contamination reduction efforts the state is pushing by requiring crops or contamination reduction outreach plans? So I'm trying to break this down. How do I think that increased access to recycling would impact the contamination reduction efforts? So I guess the kind of subtext of that question is, do I think that contamination would go up through increased access? And correct me if I'm wrong on that, Karen, but that's what I'm understanding from that question. And I don't know that answer. It might not. Ultimately, though, that is going to be the responsibilities of the producers to figure out, because they are still going to have to hit these targets. And if they are increasing access without providing clear education with that, then that's going to negatively impact them getting to their goals. So that's what it's kind of, as I mentioned, EPR is kind of like a very big concept, and there's a lot of different pieces. Anything in isolation, if you look at it in isolation, yeah, it could happen. But if they are working in concert with each other and all of the pieces are fitting together, then that's how you get to that more modernized system.
And if I could add, so the whole goal of this actually is to reduce contamination by a lot. And that is because there are quite a few features in the bill that would do that. One is a uniform list across the state. So everyone is working with the same stuff that's going in the bin. And so then you would not have as much confusion when you see an ad from Seattle and you don't live in Seattle. And also to do a coordinated education campaign across the state. So this would supplement and complement the existing work and actually reimburse the staff at the local jurisdiction who is doing the education outreach. So that's item one. Item two is, in the bill is a target that Preston mentioned, that by 2030, all materials that are put into the market that are packaging and printed paper, printed products, would be recyclable, compostable, or reusable. So that way there's going to be a lot less wish cycling, because everything will basically need to go, if you get it, it needs to be able to go into into either the compost bin or the recycle bin, or be reusable. And there's a third thing that I'm forgetting. Okay, so maybe we keep going.
You jump back in if you remember it. So Tony, that's a good segue too, Heather. Thank you. Tony asked, by creating a statewide recycling program, would that lessen what King County currently recycles? So I think Tony's kind of alluding to the list aspect of it. So I'll talk to that. And the harmonized list that I referenced earlier is more or less a floor and not a ceiling. Certain jurisdictions could collect more if they wanted. They would have to work with the producers on that to make sure the producers want to cover that. That's where some of the nuances of the reimbursement come into play. So far as if there's particular items that you want to pay for that the producers don't see as kind of benefiting them on getting to their goals, then jurisdictions are still allowed to do that. Those programs may not be covered by the PRO. So far as reimbursement. So that would have to be a jurisdiction level decision, but the harmonized list is really trying to avoid, reduce confusion and create a floor for what is accepted statewide.
And then if we can add on that, the idea here is to really upgrade the MRFs and the sorting and robots and opticals that they have, so they actually can do more, get cleaner bales. And so that means that things could go in more easily to actually come out the other end of the door that are well sorted. So I'm thinking, for example, of flexible packaging. In order to really get that flexible packaging sorted out of the rest of the stuff, ultimately we want that flexible packaging to all be recyclable, et cetera. So the idea here is to upgrade the full system, everything from design to education to infrastructure, and then have the end markets that actually want that stuff. Like polypropylene tubs is a great example. Polypropylene tubs are right now sort of problematic in terms of recycling. We're actually working on post-consumer recycled content mandate for those, and that will help drive the market and make it worth separating them out so that they can be in their own bale and go to a market.
Thank you, Heather. I see Henry put a question. You kind of touched on this, Heather, but just building a little bit more on this. Henry asked, but won't markets still differ from place to place? So won't acceptance lists differ? How can we make a uniform list statewide? I think that, yes, in isolation, markets right now, they're different from place to place. Materials are going to particular MRFs based on what contract that jurisdiction has with its MRF and what makes sense for them. When you start to put this on a collective system and start to look at it statewide as kind of all working in concert with each other, then those the producers would be looking at things through the needs assessment, like current recycling infrastructure, trying to build out a plan that's going to make the most sense from an efficiency perspective. So yes, markets would probably decrease on being different because you would have more efficiency in transport, what materials are going to what MRF, those sort of things, all that would be addressed in the needs assessment. And for folks on this call, which has opportunities for feedback from you so that you can, give more information into that assessment so that they know how it's going to impact your jurisdiction in particular. Good question.
I would say for most materials, the markets are kind of the market. Like for example, cans, they want them, so they're going to go. But glass is a good example where you do have that regional variation because of the cost of transportation. So the end market for glass is more challenging. And so that glass is going to have to be looked at sort of more closely. But the idea is that all the glass will be recycled, and it could be maybe not into new bottles. It might be it's going to fiberglass or concrete and other things.
Thank you.
It's like some hand raises as well.
Heather Church.
How to get through all those on the chat.
Heather, Heather Church, I was about to read your question. Do you have your hand up because you just want to come on camera and show us your face and ask it yourself?
No, I thought you were reading from me before, and I was like, well, that wasn't technically my question, so I'm gonna just be quiet now.
Yeah. Okay. Well, jump in there if I don't appropriately answer it, if you still have questions. So Heather asked, because Washington State has always maintained that local jurisdictions have the authority to decide their recycling list, how do you envision implementing a statewide list and changing this authority structure? I think that this is kind of my perspective. I think in more conversations that I've had with educators in different jurisdictions, at least in the Puget Sound area, and then some on the east side, I think that there's been a lot of frustration around kind of having to continuously educate customers, be it them moving or moving out into a new place, about what is accepted in their jurisdiction. And I think that this will help a lot. I think that it would probably be embraced across the state so far as helping with that education and outreach. And then the producers would be responsible for thinking about, what do we want to educate residents statewide on, and what do we want to leave it to the local jurisdictions to let them do their education and outreach, and then we will reimburse it.
And to be clear though, if you pass a state law, it does supersede local jurisdictions in specific ways. So look at, for example, e-waste and paint and things like that. But as Preston said, this creates a floor. So the floor is that the producers will reimburse a city or county or whoever for the materials that are in their plan that are being recycled. If the city decides to go above and beyond, or county, and have more material collected, and their list is a bigger list, then they would not get reimbursed for that at that time. Although overall, the goal is to then move towards everything being recyclable or compostable or reusable. And I think there's a question on that. What's the question about?
Yeah, it's from us Pierce County folks that don't accept compostable packaging. That's really what I think Karen's question is are there plans and funds to build out composting infrastructure statewide? Because right now it's not there.
Okay, so that's a great segue into when I just talked quickly about the organics bill. So there's another mega effort going on, and this is really focused on 2023. So not this coming legislative session, but the session after, and that is to look at methane and organics reduction in the state. In other words, to divert organic materials, so that's food waste, yard waste, and other organic material from the landfill, so we can reduce methane. And this is a climate change bill that is being championed by Representative Joe Fitzgibbon. And that's 2023 with a little bit of some early actions that could be done in 2022. That will be definitely tackling, although it's hard to tackle, this issue about compostable material. Oh yes, Paul Jewell has been super engaged in this process.
This is getting out of my pay grade. What are the chances of this legislation passing in 2022?
Okay, well, as the only person allowed to talk about that between me, Adrian, and Preston. So you never, yes, we are gunning for 2022. You never ever will pre-say anything. We will never speak for the legislators in a public forum.
Michelle, I see I'm sorry for avoiding you and missing your hand up, but yeah, did you have a question or comment?
Okay, so my question, and I know Heather kind of touched on it. Is there a possibility of making facilities more regional based? I'm in a county, Clickitat County, we're very rural. And yes, we do have a recycling program, but unfortunately with the way our program works, our drivers have to drive 1,800 square miles of area, then to take it eastbound, be put on a trained all the way to Seattle for all recyclable material except for glass, which gets trucked to Portland. So for us, although we are part of the recycling program, at a certain point, recycling becomes kind of a negative versus a positive because we're putting a lot more CO2 into the air by doing that. If we go to a more regional based approach, I think it would be easier having a closer facility where recyclable materials could go. So is that something that is being looked at as part of the EPR?
So the needs assessment, the needs assessment is the first thing out of the gate. That's the first big effort of the program if it gets passed. And that is absolutely looking at what is the infrastructure and capacity of today, and then where do we need to get in order to be able to hit the targets that are in the statute and ultimately in the plan that the producers make the plan. I was going to say the pro plan. And so those are exactly the kind of questions that would be looked at there. We are very in a good shape in Washington for that needs assessment because there's a whole ton of previous plans that have been, or studies that have been conducted in the last few years, partly in thanks to Senator Rolfes's SB 5397 that passed in 2019 as a study bill. So we have, there's already really good documentation of kind of where we're at today. So that gives us a leg up on, okay, now what do we need to do in order to make the system a way better system overall in terms of exactly the kind of question you're asking, Michelle.
Yeah, and one thing I've thought about too, Michelle, is kind of thinking about it from the producer's perspective as they're putting this plan together. You know, with costs for transport and things like that being reimbursable and being covered under that reimbursement, it's not an incentive for them to be hauling, you know, long distance hauling trucks all over the state. One, to meet their goals, but also two, from a cost perspective as well. So they're going to have to look at, is it better to set up regional operations like that and things that are going to reduce that transport time so that we can reduce our costs too. So I think the ultimate, because these goals are in place and because of the reimbursement model that's in place with this proposed bill, I think that they will give that a very hard look and make some decisions, yeah, based on what's going to work. Okay. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat, but please jump in if I missed it too.
So if folks want to get involved in the EPR, they want to be a part of the stakeholders, the planning, the implementation, how would they go about being involved in that? Is there someone they should contact? Some people, I suppose, because I suppose there's a lot of different areas.
So there is some stakeholder work, a lot of stakeholder work going on right now. For the cities and counties, you do have your associations that are very, very highly engaged in it. So you will at least first want to go through those. If you do have sort of a lobbyist and more of an interest in getting more involved beyond your association, I would say reach out to me, because I'm the person who I don't think Adrian and Preston can be involved in the legislative part directly, but I can, and I can get your lobbyist engaged in the process.
And then there will be, you know, as this thing evolves, both that piece and then if it is adopted, there, you know, when I've shown you the timeline, there is more opportunities for input as well. But I would definitely suggest people keeping an eye on this and thinking about how it's going to impact your jurisdiction and having conversations with other professionals in the industry to make sure that, you know, you're keeping up to date on the evolution of it, because it is a lot of moving parts and a big bill. Adrian?
I'd also like to add that, of course, the Northwest Product Stewardship Council is there to provide information and answer any questions. And if anybody of the government agencies are curious to know more and have some questions or concerns, would be happy to have a one-on-one talk or go through some of these things. That's the whole reason the Northwest Product Stewardship Council exists, in order to work with government agencies across Oregon and Washington and learn from EPR and how to make it as good as it can be for us all. So definitely feel free to reach out anytime.
Thank you. Other questions, comments, points of confusion, moral dilemmas? Lindsay asked, how similar will the Washington Renew bill be to the Oregon and Maine structures? Heather, I'll ask you to jump in there, but
yeah, I'll answer that one, sure.
Yeah, from our perspective, I was just going to say the main one with the collections aspects not being covered in the Oregon bill. That's something that we as a municipal hauler we've been keeping our eye on and how that plays out. But I'll let Heather speak to the other nuances.
And Lindsay, you should have also asked, but you didn't know to ask this, New York. So there were 11 states that offered, that introduced bills last year, earlier in 2021. Sorry, hard to say last year yet, but anyway, this year, that were related to extended producer responsibility for these covered products. And Maine and Oregon passed, and New York actually came close to passing, New York State. And there was also one in Maryland that came, got along pretty far. And I understand that in Colorado, there's a pretty major effort going on as well. So this is something that is actually in many, many states being moved forward. Plus there's actually federal legislation, the Break Free from Plastic Act, that has actually the Washington approach from the original Senator Rolfes bill is the centerpiece of that original federal legislation. So in terms of how this bill is similar or different from those, what happened is we had a version that Senator Doss introduced last year. That would be December 17th of 2020. COVID messes you up. And that bill has now been significantly modified to bring in components from Oregon and Maine and New York. One example is the needs assessment. Another example is the advisory council, the seats on the advisory council, which is going to have a very big role of helping shape the needs assessment and reviewing the plan and having a pretty significant role throughout, and give a voice to local governments, give a voice to environmental groups, give a voice to the recycling industry and the producers. And we're working out, the balance of all those on that advisory committee. That was looked at, and we looked literally at the New York and the Oregon bills for that. I feel like there was one other major piece that we brought in. Oh yeah, there's MRF reporting that was brought in, because in Oregon, their bill, they actually are going to have MRF certification. We're not going to do that here, but we do want to kind of have things be at least somewhat aligned. We can't do that because we actually already regulate the MRFs in a different way than they do in Oregon. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Anyway, so we basically were able to learn from those two bills, and also just from all the other things that are going on around the United States in the past year, to really work hard on this the draft we're working on right now, to really bring in new components and also address stakeholder issues.
Thanks, Heather. And Lindsay, yeah, feel free to jump in if there's some particulars in there that you would like to know, but I think Heather did a great job of covering it, kind of broad perspective. Other questions?
I have a question for the group. So now that you've heard Preston, can you go out and tell someone what this bill is, or what this EPR approach is? If not, ask that question now. Like what if you were to say in one sentence what it is, could you do that? And or do you have questions? Basic questions. There is no bad question right now.
So, all right, I'll ask a bad question. From what I gather, it sounds to me like the producer responsible organization, or the PRO, defines everything. Like all the control goes to that group. And although there might be stakeholder other meetings or other conversations happening, it sounds to me like they define what can be recycled, what they want to be recycled, how much gets paid for the recycling. So their, I guess, control reaches further than just in the manufacturing of products, which is their current role.
So yes and no. Great question, Rick, by the way. Yes and no. So here's what we're doing. We are keeping intact the Washington governance system. The local control actually is maintained, and the UTC system is maintained and those contracts are maintained. So it kind of looks like it's all going to the producers, but in fact, we are not doing that. It is actually a collaborative approach in the way it's done. Now, what the pro is trying to figure out is what are the material, they have to get to the targets. And in fact, collectively, everyone has to get to the targets. I wouldn't say just the producers have to get to the targets. The goal is upgrading the system for everyone so that we get to these targets by 2030 or whatever year we end up negotiating for that year. So in fact, at this point, it'll probably be 2031 because we're going to add 1 year to everything at this point. So if you're a service provider, you're going to still be the one doing and making decisions about how you're going to run your program, or your service, but you're going to need to meet some convenience standards and some performance standards that probably you're already aiming for anyway. But anyway, that would be like, for example, let's say you're now going to be collecting from multifamily as well as single family in a jurisdiction. So that would be an expansion for you, and then you would be reimbursed for that. Have I answered your question, Rick? The existing structure stays in place, but now there's some new targets that are going to be coming in. In order to meet those targets, you need to meet those targets in order to get reimbursed through either the city or directly.
Well, I think you did answer it, and
okay.
I think you answered it and helped me understand that this is complicated. I think it's more complicated than I can try to figure out today. But I've been reading through the draft legislation, and one thing that stuck out to me during the presentation is communicating to the residents that recycling is free. I think that's something we've done in the past, and the accountability across residents, I felt like diminished the quality of material that was going inside the carts. So this to me sounds like a little bit backwards when we went to kind of the commingle model, the pay as you throw, hey, recycling's free. We've learned some lessons with China Sword and how the markets had to adjust to that. And MRFs were starting to now charge for a processing fee. Like it does cost money to collect and process material. So is that something that you see us as kind of a challenge moving forward? Because at the end of the day, when we want to see recycling numbers increase, people need to choose to recycle. And I have friends that do not choose to recycle, although I advocate hard. I bring them recycle containers to put inside their kitchen to make it easy. And unless I put it in the recycle bin for them, I'm not seeing their cart fill up every 2 weeks.
By the way, I'm impressed that you do that. So here's the thing. The goal is to make it really easy for the consumer, easier than it is already, because but all the materials actually are recyclable, so there's less of that wish cycling, and also to have one list so they're less confused, and also to get it to them. So can we force people to recycle? No, but we're trying to make it a heck of a lot easier by having a better system overall for them. I'm always an advocate saying, no, we can't put the burden on the consumer. We've got to make it super easy for them, because I agree. There are a lot of people out there, people I know too, who don't recycle. And, honestly, in my own home, we probably don't get it right every moment either. So how do we make it super duper easy? And the whole idea of this more collaborative statewide approach is to do exactly that. So hopefully, Rick, it will help make your life a lot easier. That's the goal, to make your life a lot easier. And by the way, to provide more jobs for Waste Connections.
Yeah, but that's something, Rick, that's something, obviously as a muni hauler, that's something that we have discussed too, because that's the way we always marketed it, right? Up until China Sword is like, you pay for your garbage can, but you can get a recycle can for free. And then, we had to add a surcharge. And there's been some good things, I think, with customers kind of becoming more cognizant of the cost of recycling. And I think to your question about like kind of getting more not recyclables in there, would be true if only looked at isolation. And if you're not looking at the upstream changes that would need to take place so far as the products being put out on the marketplace, that would, like Heather was talking about, when producers are starting to design products that work within the current system and are recyclable, then you're going to get cleaner streams because there's just not the other products on the market. They can't purchase them.
But you are right. There is a problem if people think it's free. That is a problem. I agree.
Another question, 5022 that we're working through and implementing, and there's also some advisory meetings going on. Do you feel like this is too much at once, or are they working together? I'm just kind of curious. And then also, if you could touch on, I suppose this isn't the first time an EPR bill has been brought forward. And so, I mean, what's taking us so long, and kind of highlighting some of the overseas, it's been going on for 20 years or whatnot. Why now?
Yeah, good question. Okay, well, let me start with that last thing. So actually, EPR started in Europe for packaging in the early 90s. So way more than 20 years. So they have the international corporations have a lot of experience with this and complying. In terms of this effort in Washington State, it actually started in 2018, although there had been conversations before that. So it has been going on for a bit. And is this too much? Well, so the goal is to actually include the stakeholder results from this summer. So the 3 products that, for those who are not, haven't been part of it, thank you, Rick, for being part of it. So there's a stakeholder process that's been looking at post-consumer recycled content for single-use cups, polypropylene tubs, and PET thermoforms. And in fact, it's gone really well. And we are on the verge of having some rates some targets and rates and dates to propose. Those are going to come out in a report in a few weeks. And those, we have a placeholder spot waiting for them in this bill to pop them right in. And the idea is to have the same framework that we did a lot of negotiating on in 5022 about the off ramps and the timelines and all that in there. So the idea is to maybe make some slight modifications, maybe to the 5022 overall structure, but sorry about that noise, but fundamentally to have those pop right in. This is a bill that has had a lot of work and a lot of discussions. And yeah, we are definitely aiming for trying to get it passed in 2022. Yes, you're right, it's big, but has that ever held us back from, by the way, collectively, everyone on this Zoom, from trying to get things accomplished? That's where we're at. But great question, Rick.
Thanks, Heather. Thanks, Rick. Do you have any follow-ups or anything, Rick, on that, or questions? You good? Just want to make sure that you got your questions or comments addressed.
No, I'm looking forward to following the process. You know, a lot of my experience came from California and Mattress Recycle Council, Paint Care. And I do know, operating a MRF, I felt like it was really difficult to manage within the boundaries of the reimbursement rates that were allotted for those materials. So I just know, as a person working MRFs and a hauler, it's really hard to cover all those, and that transparency involved in rate making and designing, it really gives me the chills when I'm trying to communicate to a producer on what it takes to really manage a MRF or a hauling company.
Totally.
Worlds apart in some
Rick,
ways.
that is an incredibly good point. That is one of the major things we've been discussing in the recent stakeholder work. And the plan right now is to actually have in the bill, you know, kind of basically the outcomes idea that you're going to have a formulaic approach to how you do it, and some other things in there like that, and then other things about reimbursement, but then to actually have the needs assessment work on sort of the technical aspect of that, and then have the plan, propose it, but then ecology would approve it based again on quite a bit of input. So you're completely right. That is one of the critical issues, is the reimbursement to the cities or directly to the service providers. In the UTC area, that rate structure would stay the same, and that is where it's a cost plus. So the service providers in the UTC, which is the Utilities, Transportation and Utilities and Transportation Commission, and that's about 40% of our residents in Washington. It's a cost of the collection and processing, plus I think about a 6% profit for the service provider. So that would stay in place. And that's actually very regulated by the UTC. And the other part will probably be somewhat similar, but it will be, you know, since it is a different sort of dynamic, it'll be different. It'll be differently looked at. But you're exactly right. That is an incredibly important part of this legislation. And we're trying to build in a very transparent and solid way to deal with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Rick, that's something.
So Rick, stay involved, Rick.
Yeah, please do. That's something I've really been focused on too, in conversations with my division man, make sure that when we're looking at costs, that we're looking at the full cost of our collection and what it actually takes relative to other things that, like a lot of our drivers are unionized, right? And so those have been negotiated at the city level. They should be getting the same benefits, those kind of things, to make sure that our costs are covered. And yeah, to your point, it takes X amount of dollars. And just like I can't provide too much input into the design of your product other than whether it's going to be compatible with a MRF or not. We know our industry, we know how to haul, we know how to collect, we know how to haul. And that's where, we have to be part of that conversation, I think, at the table to say, this is what it costs, and this is of value to our residents too. And especially with City of Tacoma, we kind of operate from a triple bottom line perspective too. So we're going to have conversations with producers about like, sure, this may, they're always looking at efficiency. What's my bottom line on this? And there is benefits to our community, to our customers, that they may not completely understand initially. And so I think it's important that, people like yourself, Rick, municipal haulers, other jurisdictions are part of those conversations to say, this is what it takes, and that this is what we need to operate and to help you meet your goals. So yeah. Other questions? I didn't see any.
I'm not sure, Heather Church, what you meant by how. Could you explain the how part? Like, are you talking about how on the elevator pitch?
Yes, exactly. That's, I guess they're something else that sometimes helps me, and what I really have appreciated from some of these folks in the comments. And I'm very familiar with EPR, and so some of my questions are also for a lot of other folks on the line here. But when you're asking for that elevator pitch, sometimes it's really great to have, a nugget of the how involved. So yes, of course, the elevator pitch is, the producer will be more responsible for the full life cycle of their products. Absolutely, that's fantastic. I think a lot of people can get on board with that. But in that elevator pitch, and when people are asking, sometimes it's nice to include that how. And again, that's where we get into a lot of that technicalities, and it's very challenging, and there's a lot of information there, and so it's hard to sum that up in a sentence. But if you guys could provide that for this group, and maybe even in writing in the chat or just verbally here, I think that can be really powerful.
Preston, you want to give it a go?
I was just thinking.
I can do one, but I think you should go first.
Okay. I would say that EPR, going back to the slide I had, I'd say EPR is a law that mandates producers are responsible for end-of-life management of their products and set specific rates and dates for packaging and paper products, which are collected through reimbursement to haulers or municipalities, or to municipalities with government oversight through Department of Ecology, and transparent end markets after they leave the MRF.
So I go even more basic when I tell people about the bill. I say we are working to modernize and revamp our recycling system in Washington by having the producers redesign what they sell in the first place, so everything is actually recyclable, compostable, or reusable, and upgrading our infrastructure and providing uniform education across the state so that everyone actually has the same list and they're not confused, and that we have, in the end of the day, a system that is working really, really well, both reducing the waste in the first place and creating a true circular economy, making things out of the things people put in their blue bin. So I go even basic, but I talk to the public a lot, so that's how I do it from that perspective.
I was trying to get to the how for Heather, but yeah, like you said, it can be.
Well, how the system will be fixed, yeah,
right.
Because we have a good system. We're just trying to make it. We're basically upgrading the system.
Yeah. We only have about 3 more minutes, so I'll just take this last comment that came in from Mary King. The frustrating thing about the existing APR programs in Washington, like drug take back, paint, et cetera, is that there's insufficient education and consumers need to seek out return locations, drive to each of them. I see people on social media telling all the time others throw their drugs in the trash or down the toilet, or the same questions over and over. And where do I take this light bulb? Absolutely, Mary. That's one of our frustrating things too. Not just about EPR programs in Washington, but just kind of in general that we see. I think a lot of times education and outreach is sometimes an afterthought with folks. And this bill and the way it's written right now is specifically calling out and funding that. So yeah, I think that you're absolutely right. It's got to be in coordination with the infrastructure changes, the policy changes, authority changes. There's got to be education and outreach so you get that information to the residents so they know what to do, because the majority of them want to participate and want to do it correctly.
Awesome. This has been really a great presentation. Thank you, Preston and Heather, Adrian, and thank you everybody who joined us today. I think that it's important to have all of you involved. I'm sure all of you have somewhere in your life, whether it be work or just personal, that this really does mean something. And, you know, if you do feel that you want to step in and you want to do more, reach out to Heather. I did put her link in there to her page. And if you want to get more information from the Northwest Stewardship program, please go to that link as well. And we enjoyed this call. It has been recorded. I believe we will send that link out. Is that correct, Michelle Wade? Awesome. So in the follow-up email, we will send the link to this. So if you have time you want to review it, or if you want to send it on to others to review it as well, please do.
Absolutely. Thank you all for
Thank you all for sticking out.
Yeah, and joining us on Monday. And, you know, I'm happy to continue the conversation with any other jurisdictions and stuff and talk about, you know, kind of the municipal aspect and kind of, you know, bounce ideas off of each other. So I want this to be the start of a conversation or continuing of a conversation. So thank you all for your time.